She had not let anyone through that door in 3 years. Not the supply boat captain, not the Coast Guard inspector, not even her own sister, who drove 4 hours north and stood in the rain for 20 minutes before Eleanor turned off the porch light. Eleanor Voss was 60 years old, and she had chosen this. The isolation, the fog, the kind of silence that has weight to it. She had chosen the lighthouse at the edge of Dunmore Island because it asked nothing of her, because it needed nothing but her hands and her discipline and her willingness to keep the light burning. She was good at keeping things burning. She was less good at letting them go out. That was why when the man appeared at her door on the worst night of the year, soaked through, bleeding from the shoulder, eyes carrying something she didn't have a word for yet, she made the only choice that would change everything. She let him in. She would spend the next 3 weeks asking herself why. But the answer, when it came, was not what she expected. The answer was not about him at all. It was about her husband and the man he had been when she wasn't watching. Eleanor had learned the language of the sea the way some people learn a second tongue in middle age. Imperfectly at first, then with a fluency that surprised even her. She could read a storm 2 hours out by the color of the horizon. She could feel pressure dropping in her knees before the barometer moved. She had been at Dunmore for 3 years, and in that time she had become part of the island's grammar, the keeper, the widow, the woman who asked no questions and answered very few. The storm that came on a Thursday in November was not the worst she'd seen, but it was ambitious. By 4 in the afternoon, the waves were clearing the lower seawall. By 6, her generator was working twice as hard. She had done everything she was supposed to do. Sealed the equipment room, checked the fuel reserves, secured the rowboat, sent the weekly status report before the radio went to static. She was making tea when she heard it. 3 knocks. Hard and deliberate. Not accidental. The sound of someone who still had strength enough to demand something. Eleanor set down her mug. In 3 years, no one had knocked on that door after dark. She stood in the kitchen for a full 30 seconds. In her mind, she was already calculating. The last ferry had left the mainland at noon. No private vessel could have crossed the strait in this weather. Whoever was on the other side of that door had come from somewhere nearby. Or they had been very, very lucky. Or they had been very, very desperate. She took the marine flashlight from the hook by the pantry, heavy enough if it came to that, and she opened the door. He was younger than she expected. Not young exactly. Early 40s, she guessed. Dark hair plastered flat by the rain. He was wearing a canvas jacket that had stopped being waterproof hours ago. His right hand was pressed to his left shoulder, and even in the beam of her flashlight she could see the dark spread of blood against the wet fabric. He didn't say please. He didn't make excuses. He looked at her with eyes that were calculating something, the distance between them maybe, or whether she was alone. And he said, "I'm not who they'll say I am." Eleanor Voss had been married to a man who said exactly what people wanted to hear for 24 years. She recognized immediately the difference. This man was telling her something true. She just didn't know what it meant yet. She stepped back from the door. "Get inside before you bleed on my threshold," she said. His name was Declan. He offered no last name, and she didn't ask for one. She'd learned in the first year of widowhood that names were the least reliable thing about a person. You could spend a lifetime next to a name and never actually know what was underneath it. She cleaned his wound in the kitchen, working with the efficiency of a woman who'd sutured her own palm once during a bad winter. The cut was shallow but long, the kind made by wire, not a blade. She filed that away. He watched her hands while she worked. Not the way men usually watched her, sizing up the widow, calculating her loneliness. This was different. He was watching her the way you watch a lock when you're trying to understand its mechanism. "You're not going to ask," he said finally. "Not yet," she said. "Most people would have asked by now." "Most people," she said, pulling the final piece of tape flat, "would also have left you in the rain." She heard him breathe, almost a laugh, but not quite, like someone who had forgotten the shape of the thing. She made him soup from a can because the power was flickering and she wasn't going to stand over the stove for a stranger. She gave him the spare room at the top of the stairs that she used for storage, cleared a path to the narrow bed, and left a stack of her late husband's clothes outside the door without explanation. Frank's clothes. She'd kept them 3 years now, never known why. She was beginning to understand that she had kept them for reasons she hadn't been conscious of. That thought should have disturbed her. Instead, standing in the hallway listening to the storm build, she felt something she hadn't felt since the funeral. She felt awake. Fully, uncomfortably, inconveniently awake. By the second day, it was clear the storm had no intention of leaving quickly. The marine radio came back online at 6 a.m., long enough for Eleanor to catch the weather report. Storm system stalled over the North Atlantic, sustained winds forecast for at least 8 more days, and then it went to static again. The ferry service had suspended all crossings. The supply boat wasn't scheduled for another 2 weeks. The Coast Guard helicopter pad on the mainland was closed. Eleanor and Declan were, in the most complete sense of the word, alone. She found this less alarming than she thought she should. He was quiet in the way that people with good instincts are quiet. He didn't fill silences with noise. He didn't make himself larger than the room required. When she asked him to be useful, he was useful, carrying fuel to the generator, helping her resecure the boathouse door when one of its hinges gave way, sitting across from her in the kitchen in the evenings with a book he'd found on her shelf and reading without commentary. It was that last thing that got her, the reading. Frank had never read. He had talked. Brilliantly, warmly, tirelessly. He had filled every room he walked into with sound, and Eleanor had loved him for it, and also, she could now admit, resented it in some private, unexamined way. She had spent 24 years never finishing a sentence because Frank had always known how it ended. She had spent 24 years being understood before she'd had the chance to understand herself. Declan read. He let her think. He didn't finish her sentences. By the third evening, they were talking. Not about anything important, about the Lighthouse, its history, the previous keeper, a man named Aldous who had held the post for 31 years before his hands gave out. About the physics of fog, which Eleanor found genuinely fascinating and which Declan listened to with an attention that felt embarrassingly rare. About nothing and everything, and the particular quality of time when there is nowhere to go and no reason to pretend otherwise. She was 60 years old. She had not talked like this. Not this honestly, not this freely, not with this specific absence of performance, since she was young enough not to know that she was doing it. She told herself it was the isolation. She told herself it was the relief of having another person in the building after 3 years of talking to the radio and the walls. She told herself all the reasonable things. But on the fourth night, when they were sitting by the window watching the storm rage against the glass, and Declan said quietly, "My wife left 2 years ago. She said I had disappeared long before I physically went anywhere." And Eleanor heard the specific weight of that sentence, the way a person says a thing they've carried too long in private. She felt something shift in the room, in herself. Not desire exactly, not yet. Something older and more patient than desire. Recognition. She knew that disappearing. She had watched Frank do it, or thought she had. She had watched him turn toward other rooms, other conversations, the great social performance of being Frank Voss, beloved, charming, civic Frank. And she had believed that was simply his nature. She had believed she was the thing that wasn't interesting enough to hold his attention. She had spent 3 years with that belief, and it had made her smaller every day. On the 6th night, he touched her hand. They were reviewing the Lighthouse logbook. Eleanor had been showing him the entries from winter storms past, the neat columns of data, the occasional human notation she allowed herself in the margins, and she pointed to something and he leaned over to see, and his hand landed over hers on the page. He didn't move it. She didn't either. Outside, the wind was doing something architectural to the sound, building it up into structures and then tearing them down. Inside, there was the logbook and the lamplight and the particular electrical silence of 2 people who are pretending not to know something. "This is a terrible idea," Eleanor said, not loudly, not accusatorially. "The way you state a fact that is also a question." "Yes," Declan said. "You're married." "Separated, but yes." He looked at her then, fully, with no calculation in it, just that careful attention she'd become used to and hadn't been prepared for. And you're still grieving, even if you don't call it that. She pulled her hand away, not because she wanted to, because she was 60 years old and she knew with the bone-deep knowledge of experience that what happens in the first moment is not the same as what you carry in the 20th. Tell me why you were running, she said. The real reason. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, not yet. She understood this. She respected it even. There are things you don't say until you know whether a person will stay. She made them both tea. They sat on opposite sides of the kitchen table. The storm didn't stop. Neither did the thing between them, which had no proper name yet but was real in the way that weather is real, present and physical and indifferent to anyone's preferences. She was 60 years old. She thought she was past this. She had been wrong. She was beginning to understand that past this is not a place you arrive. It's a story you tell yourself, and sometimes the story stops being true without warning. On the 9th day, his phone found signal for 40 minutes. Eleanor was in the lamp room doing her morning check. She came down to find Declan standing in the kitchen with his phone in his hand and an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not cold exactly, contained, the way a person looks when they are holding a great many things very still. He looked up at her. They've issued a warrant, he said. She didn't ask who they were. For you. Yes. She poured coffee. She set his in front of him. She sat down. Tell me now, she said. All of it. He told her. He told her that he worked for the Federal Financial Crimes Unit, that for the last 3 years he had been operating under deep cover inside a network of maritime smuggling and money laundering that reached from the eastern seaboard to 3 countries in Western Europe, that the people who had issued the warrant for his arrest were not law enforcement, that the wire and the wound it left had been a warning, he told her, that his cover had been blown 9 days ago. He told her that the last confirmed safe route out of the northern coast had been Dunmore Island. He told her that when he'd knocked on her door, he hadn't known whose lighthouse it was. He hadn't known it was hers specifically. He had simply needed shelter. And then he told her the thing that changed everything. He told her that the network he'd been investigating for 3 years had a primary financial architect on the East Coast, a man who had used a series of shell companies and a legitimate marine supply business as a money channel for 2 decades, a man who had been extraordinarily careful, a man who had died 3 years ago before the investigation could close around him. He said the man's name. Eleanor heard it the way you hear a sound you recognize from a different context. For a moment, it meant nothing. Then it meant everything. Frank, her Frank, civic Frank, beloved, charming, warm, endlessly social Frank, who had run his marine supply business for 22 years and served on the Harbor Authority Board and sponsored the youth sailing program and was eulogized by the mayor of the city at his funeral. That Frank. She sat very still. How long have you known whose lighthouse this was? Her voice surprised her. It was steadier than she felt. Since day 4, Declan said quietly. I found the logbook with your name on the first page. I recognized it from the case files. And you didn't tell me. No. Why? He looked at her. He didn't look away. Because by day 4, I already knew you didn't know, he said. And I wasn't sure, I'm still not sure, whether telling you would be justice or just cruelty. Those aren't always different things. Eleanor stood up from the table. She walked to the window. The storm was beginning to thin at the edges. The first real light she'd seen in 9 days. She watched it without seeing it. 24 years of marriage. A house. A life. Summers on the water, and winters arguing about the heating and the specific ordinary texture of building something with another person. She had believed she knew Frank Voss. She had believed his love, if not his full attention. She had believed, at the very minimum, that what she had lost when he died was real. And now a federal agent sitting at her kitchen table was telling her that the man she'd mourned for 3 years had been a criminal. That the quiet grief she'd been cultivating in this lighthouse, the careful, dignified grief of a widow who had loved truly and lost truly, was built on something that wasn't true. She pressed her palm to the glass. It was cold. The cold helped. "What happens now?" she said. "To you. I need to get off the island and reach my handler. I have evidence cached in 3 separate locations. If I can get to them, the case closes." "And if you don't?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then the people who put a wire across my shoulder find another way to ask their questions." Eleanor turned from the window. She looked at this man, this stranger who was not a stranger, who had eaten her food and read her books and touched her hand and carried in his work the answer to every question she'd been afraid to ask about her own life. She thought about what it means to keep a light burning. She thought about Frank. She thought about who she was before Frank and who she had become while he was lying to her, and who she might be allowed to be now that she knew the truth. "The storm breaks tomorrow," she said. "The Coast Guard resumes runs by noon." She crossed the kitchen, picked up her satellite phone, the backup, the one that didn't depend on the tower. "I have a contact in the Maritime Authority. She owes me a favor and she doesn't ask unnecessary questions." She held out the phone. "Why?" Declan asked. "Because," Eleanor said carefully, "I have lived in this lighthouse for 3 years protecting a grief that wasn't accurate. I would like to stop that." She paused. "And because justice delayed is still justice, even when it comes in the wrong order." The Coast Guard cutter arrived the following morning at 10:47. Eleanor had spent the night not sleeping, which was different from her usual not sleeping. Her usual not sleeping was a gray, hollow thing, the kind that comes from absence. This was the other kind, the kind that comes from too much presence, from having to hold several true things at once and not being sure of their order. Frank had been a criminal. She had loved him anyway, not knowing, but still. She was 60 years old, and a man with careful eyes and a wound on his shoulder had sat in her kitchen for 9 days and reminded her that she was still alive in ways she had been determined to forget. These things were all simultaneously true. She was learning that simultaneously true was harder to carry than simply painful. Declan came downstairs with the canvas bag he'd arrived with, drier now, the shoulder of it patched with a piece of tape she'd found in the supply room. He looked different in daylight. Or maybe she was looking at him differently. "My handler will want to speak with you," he said. "You're not in any trouble. Frank was... The evidence clears you completely. But they may have questions about accounts, about the business, things you might have information about without knowing you have it. I'll answer what I can. You might want a lawyer." "I've been wanting a lot of things lately," Eleanor said. "I'm learning to take them in the right order." He almost smiled. That almost smile she'd catalogued over 9 days. The one that arrived half a breath before the real thing. The one that meant he was genuinely surprised by something. They walked down to the dock together. The sea had rearranged itself into something calmer, though not calm. The way it is after a big storm when the water still carries the memory of violence. The light was extraordinary. The November light on that coast after a storm is the most honest light Eleanor had ever seen. It illuminates without flattering, which is either cold or generous, depending on where you're standing. She was 60 years old. She was standing in the most honest light she had ever seen. She was going to have to learn all over again the true shape of the life she had lived. She found that she was not afraid of that. She found that she was, against all reasonable expectation, ready. At the dock, he stopped. He turned to her. She already knew what he was going to say. She'd known since the kitchen, since the hand on the logbook, since the first night he'd looked at her with that calculating patience, and she'd felt the specific shock of being truly seen after a long time of not being. "This isn't," he started. "I know what this is," Eleanor said, "and what it isn't, and I know the difference." He looked at her. "What I know," she continued, "is that I spent 24 years married to a man who was a stranger to me in ways I didn't discover until too late. And I spent 3 years mourning a version of that man that didn't fully exist." She looked out at the water. "And I spent 9 days in a storm with someone who told me the most difficult truth of my adult life and had the decency to let me decide what to do with it." She looked back at him. "That's not nothing." "No," he said. It's not. What happens after the case closes?" He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. I don't know, he said honestly. I've been undercover for 3 years. I don't know what's on the other side. Neither do I, Eleanor said. I'm beginning to think that's the point. The Coast Guard cutter was 30 feet away. His handler, a compact woman with gray-streaked hair who moved like someone who was always ready for something, was standing at the bow watching them with the measured patience of a professional. Declan picked up his bag. He looked at Eleanor one more time. That full, unguarded look that she suspected was rare for him, that she suspected he did not give to many people. And he said, "Thank you for letting me in." Eleanor stood at the dock and watched the cutter move out through the channel, and she felt the specific peculiarity of the moment. The way that some things end and don't end simultaneously. The case would go forward. Frank's name would be in documents she would be asked to sign. The life she thought she'd had would be revised in the public record. And she was 60 years old, standing in clear winter light with the lighthouse at her back, and she was not the woman she'd been 10 days ago. She was something harder and cleaner and more honest. She was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely herself. The case closed in the spring. It made the news the way financial crimes usually do. A brief, complicated flurry of headlines that the public struggles to follow, then a steady fade. Frank Voss, marine supply business owner, was named posthumously as the primary domestic financial architect of a network that had laundered over $40 million across 2 decades. His estate, it turned out, contained significantly more than Eleanor had believed. The lawyers used words like proceeds of crime and civil forfeiture and other words she had to look up. She kept the lighthouse. That, at least, had been her own earnings, her own choice, her own 3 years of careful building. She gave the rest to a maritime rescue foundation. It felt correct. Her sister came to visit in April, drove 4 hours north, and this time, Eleanor left the porch light on. They sat in the kitchen, and her sister said, "I never trusted Frank." And Eleanor said, "I know." And there was a long silence that wasn't angry and wasn't sad exactly, just the particular weight of things being finally said. She heard from Declan in May. A letter, which surprised her. She hadn't known people still wrote letters. He was back in the city. The cover identity had been officially retired. He said his handler had described Eleanor as the most composed civilian witness in 14 years of federal work, which Eleanor read twice because it was the most unexpectedly gratifying compliment she had ever received. He said he was learning, slowly, what was on the other side. He said he thought about the lighthouse more than was probably useful. She wrote back. She told him she had started painting again. She'd given it up when Frank's social life became so consuming that the evenings disappeared. She said she was painting the storm light, the specific quality of November light after violence. She said she found it more interesting than peaceful landscapes. She did not invite him back. She did not close the door either. She was 60 years old and she was a widow, and she was someone whose life had contained a lie she hadn't known about and a truth that arrived in the wrong weather. And she was painting again. And she was not the woman who had stood in the dark for 3 years keeping a light burning for a grief that wasn't entirely accurate. She was something newer than that, something that had not needed rescuing, something that had, in fact, done quite a bit of the rescuing itself.